Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go.
Hey, John, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Excellent. Thanks.
I'm glad you're on the podcast. I'm glad you're able to talk to me. Let's talk about, you're obviously an expert in security, but it took a while to get there. Can you tell us more about your story?
Sure, 100%. I started out as a Marine Corps infantry officer. After I got out of the military, went to the private sector. I worked as a manager at a security services firm for several years, and then I got hired in-house on the corporate side. A high amount of my focus is on international travel and making sure that our travelers overseas are adequately protected and safeguarded. And I do that through a variety of separate ways. When I first got started, we were oriented purely on security, but now the industry in general has evolved to a more holistic approach. So we look at health issues, we look at medical, we look at the impact of other things that could potentially hurt our travelers or result in problems for them.
So if you're dealing with global operations, I had a really special opportunity to talk with a couple of the banking industry like VPs, whether it's Drew or Corey Smith, who's on here, and I'm trying to understand situational awareness from a global perspective. If you're dealing with individuals who are traveling in a global environment, what does situational awareness look like for you? Like, how are you gathering intelligence? Is it working with other agencies? Is it open source information? Is it news? Is it a combination of, I'm sure it is. How does that actually work?
Yeah, I think to start with, whenever we're evaluating travel or assessing a trip, we want to look at three different areas. So the first thing we're looking at, and the most obvious probably, is the place the person's traveling to or people are traveling to. So what type of issues exist there? And to acquire the information on that, there's a variety of open source intel areas that you're able to tap. One thing that's outstanding resource is the State Department's OSAC, which is Overseas Security Advisory Council. It provides a variety of information completely free on areas around the world, and it provides you the ability to interact with their analysts and so forth and ask questions. And there also are a number of services that you can hire basically to provide intel feeds. And as with anything of that type, you want to kind of pull from multiple sources. So you don't want to rely on one sole source to kind of establish what your impression is of that area or that picture. You want to try and pull from a variety of sources if you have contacts on the ground in that particular city or in that country or that region. Being able to talk to them in advance of travel is helpful as well. And then beyond understanding the particular area they're traveling to, you want to understand about the traveler as well and their profile. And we can expand on this afterwards if you want. It can be tricky in some areas because of privacy concerns. So oftentimes it's more a matter of educating the traveler about things that they might want to think about or consider as they evaluate their travel. And the third one is, what type of activity will the traveler be involved in at that location? So, for example, an executive who's flying into a city to attend a couple of meetings and fly back out, the profile is going to be a lot different than an international aid worker who may be in areas where there's a high degree of poverty, interacting with the population locally and so forth. So understanding all those different facets helps us understand the type of concerns we might have, the potential exposures, and how we can handle that best.
The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today.
CBRNE Convergence, the world's largest conference for the non-conventional threat, is heading back to Orlando between October 28th and 30th, 2024. With 3 days of workshops, lectures, and interactive sessions delivered by speakers from around the world on the latest issues and approaches to CBRNE and hazmat. Make sure to claim your early bird discount by registering now at cbrneworld.com/event/Orlando.
I have about 15 different questions I want to ask based off of what you just said. So I'll
Sure.
try to keep it down to two or three. Recognizing that your primary focus is security, however, you're looking at the more of the holistic approach. I'm thinking back to the 2004 tsunami, the Indian Ocean tsunami that hit 20 countries, 300,000 people dead, knocked out comms, knocked out, basically the capability to travel, right, to get people out to, extract them otherwise. From I'll do the natural hazard perspective, and then I'm going to go into more of the real world security perspective. When something like that happens, what is the chain reaction internally? If you're understanding the traveler, but all comms just got knocked out, you're kind of a world away. What is the process from a strategic standpoint that we can learn from getting things from chaos to routine mode? How does that operation work out?
I think you really hit on an important aspect of it, and that's the comms piece. So unfortunately, a lot of times that's one of the first things that ends up going down. So I think having understanding of the areas where your travelers are generally going, the areas where they ought to be at a certain time, and there's a variety of different avenues to kind of do this through being able to monitor their individual travel records, to see the flights they're on, the hotels that they have booked, and so forth, to at least have a general picture of who should be in certain places at certain times, who's potentially affected. And then more austere environments, you can look at things like having SATCOM, but a lot of times that's not something you're going to necessarily plan for or foresee. And you have some countries where you can't import it, or in order to import it, you need to get a special license and so on. So the reality is, I think a lot of times when these things happen, there's going to be an information gap, because you're not going to necessarily have comms in any shape or form. But I think understanding at least who's potentially affected and who's not. So if you have people that you think are there, you may call them. And I was supposed to be in Indonesia, but now I'm in Japan. So you can say, well, okay, at least I know that John Smith is okay. He's already out of the affected area. But you're going to always have an element where there's a challenge when you don't have comms, I think.
If you know that in these circumstances that comms is an issue, information gap is a reality, I would assume that the stress level remains fairly low. Like, I've been in a ton of hurricanes. When a hurricane hits, it doesn't really get me stressed out. While there's a lot of things to do and that can be stressful, the fact that remains that you kind of have to wait the storm out, right? What gets your stress level to go a little bit higher? When are you like, ooh, this is beyond the mark? Like, from a leadership standpoint, like how do you keep your cool, and what makes you kind of lose your cool?
Yeah, I think in that scenario, it gets concerning maybe when comms come back up and you can't reach the individuals that you're hoping to reach, right? I mean, I think you hit on an important point. I think a lot of times there has to be a certain amount of acceptance. And unfortunately, our world now, we're so tied to technology that we're in the habit of having information instantly. And we're not in the habit necessarily of operating in an environment where there's an absence of information or absence of comms. And it can result in a lot of anxiety for other people within the organization too, who haven't necessarily had experience with crises of that type and situations of that type. But sometimes when you don't have comms, as you stated, you just have to accept it and hope for it to come back up. But then the problem is when it comes back up and you can't find the individuals you want to find, it's a little bit more problematic then.
Well, there's a range, right? I mean, if you're tracking 5 billionaires in a submarine and all of a sudden you columns, you might not be getting them back, right? So there has to be some kind of even litmus test of, hey, okay, this is concerning, or, from an organizational standpoint, from a risk management standpoint, you've done everything you're supposed to do, and, walking through that process. This show famously is apolitical. We don't care about either political side. I mean, we don't get into political topics. But the time of this recording, this is going to be a few weeks until it comes out. Obviously, we just had an assassination attempt on a former president. There's a whole lot of congressional hearings right now. There's a lot of happening from your standpoint. When Uvalde happened, that was a major issue for me. because the responders were using 1990s tactics, i.e. call out, wait outside, wait, they expressed gross negligence in my world. And now we're dealing with parents who expect to go into buildings when they should not be going to buildings. It's a cultural shift that I'm dealing with. Right now, because of the assassination attempt, because of a lot of information warfare from actors around the world otherwise, security is being hit big time. Traditional forces for good are not considered forces for good anymore. I'm just trying to keep that in a general sense. From you in the security world, what is your perspective on what happened with the assassination attempt? And from a planning perspective, how do we avoid maybe some of the gaps in the future?
Well, I think before I hit on that, I think you hit on some important aspects. I think the first thing is that even back to the election in 2020, we started to experience a situation where we started thinking about things within the United States that normally were things we only would think about overseas. Planning routes. What are our alternate routes? What are we using for transportation? What happens if there's unrest in a certain area? And these were things that, I mean, it's not unprecedented in the United States. We've had that happen in our history before, but we started to find ourselves in 2020 employing a lot of the tactics that you would employ internationally in areas which are higher risk. I think it will be similar in 2024. So I think that's a concern. I think when you see some of the things that have happened in the United States with professional agencies where there have been issues or failings and problems, I think you can compound that a lot when you go to the developing world. So understanding that if you get into a situation in an area where you may not have the response that you would have within the United States in terms of the police or fire, ambulance, what have you. And I think that's an important aspect. I don't think I'm exactly answering what you asked me, but it is an important aspect. I think in terms of the assassination attempt, and I hesitate to really offer opinions on that, but I think it's an important with all of these things to kind of view it from a constructive lens and say, what things here can I learn? What things can I see that we could go and apply in the future to improve our own operation? And that can be very macro. It can be a matter of making sure that we're tying up any particular seams that exist with any particular spaces or gaps that are out there. A lot of times resources are constrained for all of us in the private sector as well, too. So understanding how to aim those resources to things which are higher probability or higher in terms of the criticality. So you may have something where the probability is not that high, but the criticality is high. So even though I don't think it's going to happen, I need to make sure I have resources which are marshaled for that, even if it means having some exposure for something that's higher probability, but the impact is smaller, if that makes sense. So,
I hope everybody who just heard you say that goes back 30, 45 seconds and memorizes everything you just said, because you perfectly described analyzing risk. You could apply that to assassination attempts. You could apply that to flooding in a local community. You could apply that to business continuity. One of the things that I often remind myself is, now I'm going to get a lot of flack from this from my audience, is how pointless a 72-hour kit is. The 72-hour preparedness kit, most people have enough supplies to live for 72 hours, and if they don't, they will live for 72 hours. Most people, unless they're on like life-saving equipment, right? And yet, somewhere down the line, we, in terms of like the emergency management community, started pushing really hard 72 hours of preparedness. And we got locked in on 72 hours, but the reality is it's much longer. Firefighters go to schools first. They don't go to homes first, for example. And I think the same thing is happening in the security culture a little bit, where we've created, whether arbitrary or not, standards of this is what's normal. This is my perimeter. This is my problem. This is somebody else's problem. And the more we do that across all industries, I think the more vulnerable we are becoming to dealing with things that historically may not have been a problem. Let's be real, a kid getting onto a roof with a gun in the past probably would have been called out a little bit faster, right? But the dynamics are changing. My bigger fear, and maybe you can help settle this a little bit, is it seems like there is an overall, there's a cultural shift. You're calling out right now, and you literally just said it, the things that you typically see overseas, now you are planning for them in the U.S. That's a problem for me. I don't want you to have to plan for those in the U.S., right? Like, I want it to be a safe and standard country. Is those perceptions? Is the reality? Is there a major cost because you're doing that? Now you're doing extra planning, you're doing extra resources. The comms vehicle alone has to be more expensive. That has to be changing your industry quite a bit.
I still think for us here, with the examples I cited, I think you're looking at smaller windows of time, though. So, for example, when things happen in the United States, they can cause issues and chaos and so forth. But most of the time, it's resolved. And I'm talking more on the security side than other events like hurricanes and earthquakes and stuff, which I'm not as familiar with. But I think most of the time they're resolved and contained within a certain amount of time. I think if you look back at a situation like when Katrina happened, which was I think about 2005, if I'm not mistaken, I think you saw a situation then where there was a serious type breakdown where you really have issue where help is not coming for an extended period of time. But generally speaking, within the United States, I feel fairly confident that we can respond in a I don't know if I would say reasonable amount of time, but a higher amount of time or a shorter amount of time than what you would find a lot of areas overseas. As I was saying, the majority of my focus is global and international. And as you start getting to areas where you may have an issue that in the United States would be very easy to resolve, but in that particular area, it becomes a serious or critical problem. So a car accident, as an example. You get into a car accident in the United States, in the majority of places, unless you're somewhere extremely isolated in the mountains or whatever, you're going to have a response. You're going to have fire come there, ambulance, what have you, get you out of the vehicle to a hospital that will provide, presumably adequate treatment. But if that happens to you in, sub-Saharan Africa, in a very austere area of sub-Saharan Africa, you may have a serious problem, and something that may have been fairly minor here can be life-threatening there. So I think from the standpoint, too, of educating staff and travelers and so on, having them understand that when I go somewhere else, I can't necessarily expect the same standard of services that I would have in my home country. And so I still feel, I hear everything you're saying with the United States, but I guess when I still compare it to the greater global world, I have a higher degree of confidence with our ability to handle things.
In the emergency management response for dynamic populations course, you'll master the art of managing large, diverse populations, like those at schools, hospitals, amusement parks, or stadiums. These scenarios demand rapid, adaptable responses where command and control, evacuation, mass care, medical transport and triage, public messaging, and counter-Sebring considerations are all put to the test. From October 22nd through 24th in Pueblo, Colorado, you'll dive into DIPOP training with the capstone Hot Mess Express exercise, taking on the role of an emergency manager as you lead your organization through chaos of a catastrophic train derailment. This high-intensity experience will push your skills to the limit as you work to protect and coordinate these ever-changing populations. Get ready to elevate your readiness in the most complex dynamic environments with DIPOP 2024. Class size is limited. Sign up today at thereadinesslab.com. Well, that's fantastic news. As a guy who lived in Japan and who travels overseas fairly often now, normal standards of care is a really interesting way to look at things, because the normal standard of care in every country I go to is drastically different, even at their healthcare, right? And so thinking about it from that lens, the global perspective of things, I think about security's role in global operations in general. I mean, if you're looking at travelers, CEOs have to, your number one salesperson in your company is your CEO, right? Like they operate the company in so many different ways. And yet going through all the way through supply chain. I had, it was the anniversary, so it would have been November of 2022. I had John Spencer on here. He's the director of urban studies at West Point, and he talked about the Mumbai terrorist attack, and essentially how, for the audience's sake, 10 individuals with headphones getting information from Pakistan was able to take down the fourth largest city in the world, right? From a security standpoint, walking through that kind of scenario where the city's on standstill, but you still have comms, how might somebody like you make sure to, A to Z, walk through that situation to get the situational awareness that you need, and then secure the individuals to get them extracted out of that site?
Yeah, I think the first thing, as we talked about earlier, is establishing who you have there. Who's there, who's potentially impacted, and try to get comms with them. So where are they? Are they in their hotel room? Are they out to dinner? Are they someplace else? And trying to, whenever possible, to establish how far they are from areas which are being impacted. So in general, particularly in the absence of information, a lot of times the safest response is shelter in place, particularly if you don't know what's going on in the environment, right? If you're somewhere where you're safe at the moment, you oftentimes are better sheltering there than you are to go out in the street and so forth. So in that particular case, I think establishing the areas that you have people at, are they safe at the present time or are they at risk? And if they are at risk, can they extricate themselves from that area to a safe haven of some kind, without necessarily exposing themselves? Now, in that particular incident, the attackers were in the hotels and were going room to room in some cases. So you potentially, even if you're sheltering in place in your hotel room, there is still an element there of potential risk that you're going to have somebody, who enters the hotel room and causes you harm. However, if you look at all the hotel rooms across the entire city, your odds are probably still okay as long as you're not in one of the hotels that's being impacted at that particular moment. So I think understanding that, establishing comms with your people, making sure they're safe, making sure they're in an area where they can either stay safe or if they're potentially at risk, if they can move safely to an area where they're out of that impacted area. But I think that's a great example of a kind of a nightmare type of a scenario because, we in the United States here, we've had an ample number of active shooter events, right? But what you saw in that particular attack was a coordinated, complex attack where they were employing fire team tactics, basically, and kind of moving through areas of the city, the train station, the hotels, the cafe, and so forth. So it's a hard situation. But I think to what I was saying earlier, too, you saw a lot of delays in the emergency response as well, too, which arguably probably exacerbated the entire situation. So I think understanding sometimes the capabilities to respond in these areas are not the same, and you need to be prepared to either shelter in place or operate independently, because you may not get the help or the first responders in the time frame that you would expect in your home country.
When you show up on scene to pick up, a CEO, do they call you Jason Bourne? Just out of curiosity. Holy crap! It's
I
Jason
haven't heard
Bourne.
that happen yet. No,
yeah. You're like, oh, this is what happened to Jason Bourne. Yeah, it's awesome to hear your perspective on that. As from trying to pull back from, I'm getting really tactical just because I'm hyper curious, but trying to pull back to the leadership perspective and the coordination aspect. You're talking about having assets on scene. You're talking about tracking the individual. You're talking about that planning process a little bit. From a leadership standpoint, when, the bat signal goes on, essentially, I'm giving you lots of credit here. When things start happening, I'm actually going to quote one of my buddies, Nat Sellers. He says, at one point, preparation ends, and now you're in response. Even if you haven't prepared for things, sometimes you're just in response. You can't plan for everything. How does a leader pull people in together, the right people, and eliminate waste of information, waste of distraction. How would you go in and working and training a team to make sure that they were their A game essentially during catastrophic disasters?
Well, I think the first thing, and you've hit on it all through the conversation, but I think the first thing is to go ahead of time and prepare for the type of situations that you potentially would encounter. And a lot of that really, I think, is also about building networks. So particularly when you're talking about in the global aspect of this, having separate networks in different regions who can assist you if there's a need for a medical evacuation, political evacuation, security services to provide like secure transportation or other types of things, but doing that prior to a crisis occurring. And of course, that's easier said probably than done, and something that takes some time and effort to maintain over time. But if you have employees, at Corporation X who are always traveling to the same 3, 4, 5 cities, and the 2 of the 5 cities are higher risk because of potential civil unrest or violent crime or terrorism, at least in those areas, you want to build up networks. You want to have providers there who can help you if something happens. You want to be familiar with the hospitals that provide higher care or clinics in some places. And you want to do as much of that on the front end as you possibly can. Now, for companies that have massive global footprints and super high numbers of travelers, it's certainly a harder lift, 100%. But I think being able to look at the areas of the greatest risk for you and for your people, and then to establish the contacts in there ahead of time, to spend time on the ground if you can. I mean, I think one of the areas in the area of travel risk that concerns me is when you're having people with these responsibilities who haven't spent a lot of time traveling or haven't spent a lot of time traveling in these kinds of areas. So they may have that responsibility, but their travel has been, the Caribbean and maybe Europe, and they haven't been to some of these other areas, or they've traveled as part of a tour group or something like that. They haven't been a solo traveler. And if their organization is sending solo travelers out to areas which are more austere or which are higher risk, then they may not have a full appreciation of the things that individual is experiencing. So I think all those aspects are important.
All right. For the last question here, because I'm looking at your time, try to be respectful of it. There has to be talents and skill sets and leadership that are unique to your industry that are different than others, especially if you're a leader in security. That has to be different than a leader in sales, for example. What are some of the common leadership qualities that are uncommon in other industries that you have found?
I don't know if they're uncommon in other industries. I wouldn't want to necessarily say it that way, but I think, it's important to have integrity, obviously, in anything that you're involved with. And I think being sure that you're an example. So speaking to, what we were talking about earlier about traveling, I think it is important with the organization is able to help you with that and support it, to be out there and travel. And travel is a singleton in some areas, and have those experiences so that you're not sending people to a place that you've never been, or you're not sending people to an environment that you're unfamiliar with. Obviously, you can't go everywhere, but at least having an idea of the types of environments that employees will encounter as they travel is going to be an important part. I think in terms of beyond that, I think it's important that there's continuous education and professional type development and so forth. I think that's extremely important because this is a very much an evolving field, particularly when you're looking at travel risk. I mean, like I said, when I started, we were very focused on security. We since have opened the aperture a bit to look at other things and things which, to be honest with you, are a higher percentage. Higher percentage, you're going to have somebody who's going to have some kind of health issue or some kind of medical problem, then they're going to become the victim of an armed robbery or terrorism or something like that. So I think advancing your skills in a professional aspect, becoming involved in industry groups is very important. We were talking about it before we started taping, but I'm the head of a group within ASIS International, which is a professional organization oriented on security. I'm the head of a subgroup there that's oriented on travel risk, and it's a great opportunity for individuals within the industry to kind of exchange information with others at other organizations, other types of organizations in other countries. And it's interesting also the perspectives, right? I mean, you think we all work in the same area, our perspectives are essentially the same or very similar, but it's actually not true. I have colleagues who the things that they're doing are quite different because of the type of travelers they have or because of the kind of nature of their organization's footprint and so on. So I think getting that kind of exposure is extremely helpful as well.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important to remember, especially there's a lot of people. You mentioned that you were a Marine. You know, we have a lot of our listeners who are in or were recently in the DoD. We have a lot of firefighters who are transitioning out, and it can seem pretty daunting, the things that they need to do in order to take their career to the next level. And you just really outlined it very well of several different key components that they can, you know, kind of take their career to the next level. My very last question to you is a fun question. Because you're a guy that deals with travelers, if you could travel anywhere in the world, where would you go?
You know, I've traveled to quite a few places. I'm headed here to Southeast Asia in a few days. If I could travel anywhere in the world, I'm trying to think of somewhere I haven't been that I would really like to go to. You may have me stumped. I don't know, maybe somewhere like Tibet or Nepal, which I have not been to. But the only thing is I don't like the cold, so I'd have to plan it carefully.
So I'm typically not a cold guy, but I've always wanted to go to the Faroe Islands. I had never even heard of it. I went over to the UK. I saw this dot on the map. I pulled it up, and it looks like something from outer world. So I don't know. Hopefully you've been there. I want to go there.
I haven't, no, but yeah,
looks gorgeous. Either way, Patrick Kane, the Jason Bourne of security. That's your nickname internally. Thank you so much for joining me, for sharing your insights, and really for everything you're doing for the field. Thank you so much.
Excellent, John. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for the invite.
All right, everybody. If you got something out of this episode, which you should have, we have to do the shameless plug every time, 5-star, and subscribe, the whole deal. If you have a question for Patrick specifically, you can email us at contact@thereadinesslab.com. We'll forward that on to him. Do something for the field, a best practice you've learned, or something cool that you have found. Put it in the comments, of course, and we'll see you for the next one. Peace.